Did you think spilling wine on me would erase who I am? His shirt clung with crimson stains, every eye fixed on him. The billionaire's laughter had filled the room moments ago, mocking the black waiter as though he were invisible. But now, silence. His voice cut sharper than glass, turning the humiliation into a weapon no one expected. What he said next left even the wealthiest guests trembling. Welcome, story lovers. From where are you watching? Hit the like button and drop your city name in the comments so we can see how far our story travels. The story begins on an ordinary evening that didn't feel extraordinary at all, at least not for him. To most people walking past the glittering glass doors of the Ashton Grand Hotel, it was a night of elegance, wealth, and luxury. The air smelled faintly of expensive perfume and polished marble. Chauffeurs waited outside with black cars lined, neatly like soldiers, headlights flickering against the cobblestone driveway. Guests arrived in gowns worth more than his yearly wages, their laughter rising above the hum of city traffic. For them, it was another glamorous evening. For him, it was another long shift. His name was Marcus Hale, a 27-year-old waiter who had worked at the Ashton for nearly 4 years. To the guests who barely looked up when he served champagne, he was invisible. Just a quiet presence in crisp black and white uniform, tray balanced steadily in his hands. But behind the uniform lay a life that most of them would never have imagined. Marcus wasn't just a waiter. He was a son, a brother, a dreamer with ambitions too large for the space life had carved out for him. And though he stood each night under the golden chandeliers of wealth, he knew what it felt like to be pushed to the margins. Marcus grew up in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of the city, where cracked sidewalks told stories of neglect, and streetlights often flickered out, leaving stretches of road swallowed in shadow. His mother, Lorraine, worked double shifts as a nurse, holding the family together with sheer determination. His father had passed away when Marcus was only 10, leaving behind not just grief, but the weight of responsibilities Marcus had to carry far too early. He became the older brother who walked his little sister to school, the teenager who juggled homework with part-time jobs, and eventually, the man who learned to wear resilience like armor. When he applied for a position at the Ashton Grand, he thought it would be temporary, just a stepping stone while he saved for community college classes. Yet, months turned into years, and the job became his constant. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it paid the bills and kept food on the table. More importantly, it reminded him every day of the world he wasn't part of, the glittering, wealthy world he served but could never touch. Some nights, that distance didn't matter. Other nights, it burned. Working in a luxury hotel meant that Marcus became a quiet observer of humanity. He watched businessmen close deals with a handshake and a smile, watched celebrities slip behind velvet curtains, watched couples toast anniversaries while he filled their glasses. He learned that wealth didn't always bring kindness. In fact, it often magnified entitlement. Yet, every so often, a guest surprised him with a genuine smile or a simple thank you. Those rare moments reminded him of dignity in small things. On the night that would change everything, Marcus had been assigned to serve at a private gala held in the hotel's largest ballroom. The event was hosted by a well-known business tycoon, celebrating the anniversary of his company. Guests included CEOs, politicians, and socialites whose names often appeared in glossy magazines. For Marcus, this meant heightened pressure, perfect posture, precise service, no mistakes. In rooms like that, mistakes weren't forgiven. They were magnified, especially for someone like him. He ironed his uniform twice before leaving for work, checking every button and seam. He polished his shoes until the leather shone like a mirror. To Marcus, appearance mattered. Not because he cared about impressing the wealthy, but because he knew that as a black man in service, the slightest misstep would be judged harshly. He had learned to move carefully, to speak respectfully, to smile even when insulted. Years of subtle slights had taught him that survival in such spaces required restraint. He knew the rules, but tonight those rules would be tested in ways he never imagined. When he arrived at the ballroom, the transformation was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow across the room, and tables draped in silk shimmered under soft lighting. Waitstaff moved in synchrony, a silent dance of trays and glasses. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music floating like a delicate thread weaving through the chatter of the elite. The room smelled faintly of roses and aged wine. It was opulence at its finest, designed to impress and intimidate. Marcus steadied himself as he picked up his tray of champagne flutes, reminding himself to stay calm. He liked to disappear into the rhythm of service. The balance of the tray, the timing of refills, the smoothness of his steps. It was his way of maintaining control in a world where he often felt powerless. Tonight, however, that control would be tested by someone who carried power, not with grace, but with arrogance. Among the guests was Evelyn Cross, a billionaire businesswoman whose reputation preceded her. She was known for her sharp deals and sharper tongue, a woman who had built her empire with ruthless determination. To the press, she was a symbol of female empowerment in the corporate world. To those who worked near her, she was feared for her temper. Tall, elegant, draped in a gown that shimmered like molten silver, she stood at the center of attention. People flocked to her, eager to curry favor. To Marcus, she was just another guest until she wasn't. As the evening unfolded, Marcus noticed her more than once, not because he sought her out, but because her presence demanded attention. She laughed loudly, gestured boldly, and carried herself with an air of untouchable superiority. When servers passed, she barely glanced at them, her hand lifting as if they were invisible extensions of the room. Marcus tried not to think much of it. He had seen worse. He had endured worse. But fate had a way of bringing their paths together. Marcus's everyday life, the careful balancing of work, responsibility, and quiet dignity, was about to collide with the cruelty of someone who had never considered the weight of her actions. He didn't know it yet, but this night would test not just his patience, but his identity, his pride, and his belief in fairness. This wasn't just another gala. This was the beginning of a story that would echo far beyond the glittering walls of the Ashton Grand. For now, Marcus moved through the room with quiet precision, refilling glasses and exchanging polite nods. His co-workers whispered about guests' demands and tips in passing, but Marcus kept his focus. He thought about his sister, who had texted him earlier about needing help with her college application essay. He thought about his mother, working another late-night shift at the hospital. He thought about the future he wanted, but couldn't yet reach. These thoughts anchored him, reminding him why he endured long nights of silent service. Still, something lingered in the air, a tension Marcus couldn't name. It was in the way guests' eyes flickered over him, sometimes too quickly, sometimes with unspoken judgment. It was in the way security guards watched staff more closely than guests. It was in the subtle reminders that no matter how hard he worked, he was there to serve, not to belong. Marcus had grown used to these undercurrents, but tonight, they seemed stronger, as though the universe itself was warning him of what was to come. He didn't yet know that a single glass of wine, a careless hand, and an act of humiliation would unravel the fragile balance he had worked so hard to maintain. He didn't know that his response, simple, human, yet profound, would leave a room full of billionaires and politicians stunned into silence. But the night was only beginning. Marcus moved gracefully through the crowd, but internally, he was hyper-aware. The rhythm of service was second nature, yet tonight it felt heavier, as if every step carried a silent test. The guest's eyes sometimes brushed over him, a fleeting acknowledgement that barely reached their lips. Many of them held conversations about million-dollar deals, luxury vacations, and political influence, topics so distant from Marcus's reality that they might as well have been speaking another language. Still, he listened. Listening had taught him much about human nature, and though no one asked for his opinion, he carried those insights home each night like unspoken lessons. He thought about how different this world was from the one he grew up in. At home, dinner meant sharing whatever his mother could stretch from her paycheck: rice, beans, maybe chicken if it had been a good week. At the Ashton, dinner meant delicacies, imported from across the world, plated in ways that looked more like art than food. At home, neighbors knew each other, supported one another, shared burdens. Here, wealth created invisible walls that separated people even as they stood shoulder to shoulder in the same room. As Marcus circulated with his tray, he caught glimpses of the hotel staff, other waiters, bartenders, kitchen workers, faces that mirrored his own exhaustion, determination, and quiet pride. They were invisible too, yet they carried the weight of the evening's perfection. They moved as if their work didn't matter, though Marcus knew it mattered deeply. If one of them faltered, the whole illusion of flawless luxury cracked. The irony wasn't lost on him. The invisible people held up the visible ones. Hours ticked by as speeches began. The host of the gala, a silver-haired CEO, stood at the podium recounting the company's achievements. Applause filled the room. Glasses clinked. Cameras flashed. Marcus remained at the edges, waiting for his cue to refill drinks. He didn't mind being unseen. In fact, invisibility gave him perspective. It allowed him to observe people without their masks, to see arrogance dressed as charm, or insecurity hidden beneath loud laughter. He thought often about how unfair it was that those with wealth were praised for qualities the poor displayed every day with far more resilience. Yet no one clapped for mothers working double shifts or for young men carrying their families' burdens. As he stood near the back wall, he noticed Evelyn Cross again. Her presence was commanding, almost theatrical. Her laughter carried above others, sharp and confident. She leaned back in her chair with an ease that spoke of entitlement, her hand swirling a glass of red wine as though she owned not just the room but the world itself. Her jewelry caught the light, emeralds that seemed to pulse with life under the chandeliers. Guests flocked to her table, eager to flatter, eager to be seen with her. Marcus felt the weight of her aura even from a distance. Not admiration, not awe, just the recognition of power wielded without restraint. He reminded himself not to stare. The last thing he needed was to attract unnecessary attention. Attention in rooms like this rarely ended well for someone like him. So, he focused on his steps, on the steady balance of his tray, on the sequence of movements drilled into him after years of service. Step, pause, smile, offer, refill, retreat. A dance of precision, a performance of humility. And yet, beneath his practiced calm, Marcus carried something few could see. Dreams. He wanted more than this. He wanted to study architecture, to design spaces where people felt dignity no matter their income. He wanted to show his sister that ambition wasn't reserved for the wealthy, that someone like them could build something lasting. These dreams sustained him through the long nights of service. He would smile, he would endure. But deep down, he promised himself he would not remain invisible forever. As the speeches concluded and the music swelled again, the atmosphere shifted into something looser, more indulgent. Guests drank more freely, laughter grew louder, conversations more careless. This was when mistakes were most likely to happen, when a server might brush too close, when a glass might tip, when tensions could flare. Marcus knew the danger. He had seen how quickly blame could fall on a waiter, how easily a small accident could become an excuse for cruelty. He reminded himself to breathe, to move slowly, to stay invisible. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It began subtly. As Marcus approached Evelyn Cross's table to offer champagne, he noticed the flicker of her gaze. Not warm, not kind. Assessing. The way someone might look at an object, not a person. She didn't smile, didn't acknowledge him beyond a brief glance, but something in her eyes lingered. Marcus felt a chill. He brushed it off, convincing himself it was nothing. Guests like her didn't notice people like him. And yet, in that fleeting look, he sensed something. Indifference mixed with disdain. He didn't know why, but he knew it would matter. He moved on, but the air around him felt heavier now. His co-workers whispered among themselves about tips and table preferences. But Marcus's mind replayed that gaze. He tried to focus on his tasks. He thought of his sister's text again, of his mother's tired smile, of his own resolve to endure. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was shifting, that something invisible had cracked. The gala stretched into its third hour, the music louder, the air thicker with wine and perfume. Marcus moved between tables, collecting empty glasses, refilling flutes, offering polite nods. His tray grew heavier with the weight of crystal stemware, yet he carried it effortlessly, his body trained to maintain balance. But his heart carried a different weight, the unease that whispered of storm clouds gathering. In moments like these, Marcus often reminded himself of something his mother once told him. People will try to make you small. Don't let them. Your dignity is yours. Guard it. Those words had carried him through countless nights of subtle prejudice, guests who refused to look him in the eye, who spoke to him as though he were furniture, who left crumbs not just on plates but on his pride. He had learned to swallow anger, to choose silence, to carry on. But dignity, his mother said, was non-negotiable. As he rounded the corner of the ballroom, passing near Evelyn Cross's table again, he couldn't help but notice the way she gestured broadly, her glass of wine sloshing dangerously near the rim. The people around her laughed at some sharp remark she had made, their voices rising in chorus. Marcus steadied his tray and moved past, focusing on his own task. Yet, even in that moment, he felt it, that sense of being watched, not with respect, not with interest, but with the quiet cruelty of someone who saw him as expendable, and though he didn't know it yet, that cruelty was about to spill, literally, into the open. Marcus took a deep breath and adjusted his tray. The night wasn't over, and the most defining moment of his life was still waiting. What he didn't know was that the way he responded, the way he carried his dignity in the face of humiliation, would not only stun the room, but would ripple far beyond it. For now he was just a waiter serving wine in a glittering ballroom. But soon he would be the center of a story no one would forget. The gala was in full swing now. The air hummed with energy, thick with laughter, clinking glasses, and the murmurs of negotiations happening under the guise of small talk. Marcus wove through the crowd with practiced ease, his tray balanced like an extension of his arm. Each step was deliberate, his eyes trained to anticipate when a guest would need a refill, when a table required clearing, when his presence was expected yet unnoticed. He had performed this silent ballet countless times. Tonight, however, there was a current beneath the surface, a tension that seemed to coil tighter with each passing moment. From the corner of the room, Evelyn Cross commanded attention. Her silver gown glistened under the chandeliers, and her emerald necklace shimmered like a talisman of power. Wherever she moved, conversations shifted, laughter followed, and admiration, or at least the performance of it, poured freely. To most in the room, she was untouchable, a woman whose wealth granted her an aura of invincibility. To Marcus, she was simply another guest, yet one whose presence unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. Marcus had encountered wealthy women before. Some were kind in fleeting moments, others dismissive, but most treated him with the sort of casual indifference reserved for furniture. Evelyn, however, radiated something sharper. It wasn't just indifference. It was entitlement, wrapped in the confidence of someone who had never once been told no. He noticed how she snapped her fingers at servers, how her laughter often cut like a blade, how her wine glass seemed perpetually tilted, careless in its privilege. The first moment of tension came when Marcus approached her table with a tray of fresh champagne flutes. Her table was crowded with admirers, politicians, CEOs, and a handful of socialites eager to bask in her glow. As Marcus leaned slightly to offer the tray, Evelyn glanced at him briefly before turning back to her companions. Her eyes slid over him without recognition, as though he were merely a shadow. She reached for a glass, her manicured hand brushing the rim. But instead of taking it with care, she jerked it abruptly, causing the liquid to slosh dangerously. Marcus steadied the tray with swift reflexes, preventing disaster. The guests barely noticed. Evelyn didn't apologize. Instead, she gave a small smirk, muttering something under her breath to the man seated beside her, who chuckled obligingly. Marcus stepped back, his heart tightening, but he forced a polite smile. He was used to these small indignities, moments, that cut deeper than they appeared. It wasn't the spill that stung, it was the smirk, the knowledge that she found amusement in a moment that could have cost him his job. He walked away, tray balanced, face calm. Inside, though, something shifted. The night wore on, and Evelyn grew bolder with each glass of wine. Her laughter became sharper, her gestures more exaggerated. Marcus noticed the way her gaze occasionally followed him, not with admiration, but with scrutiny, as though she were measuring the limits of his composure. Each time he approached her table, his chest tightened with quiet dread, yet he carried on, his movements flawless. He knew the rules of this world. The guest was always right, and the server was expected to endure. Still, endurance has its limits. Near midnight, when the gala had reached its most raucous point, Marcus approached. Evelyn's table again. This time she held her glass lazily by the stem, swirling the deep red liquid with reckless abandon. As Marcus moved past, carefully balancing his tray of refills, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her arm stretching outward in a careless arc. In that instant, the inevitable happened. The glass tipped, and a splash of wine burst into the air. It wasn't an accident, not entirely. Marcus saw it in her eyes, the slight flick of her wrist, the way she let the glass tilt just enough. The crimson liquid cascaded across his pristine white shirt, staining it in an instant. Gasps rippled through the table. Conversations faltered. For a brief moment, the room seemed to freeze. Evelyn set her empty glass down with a laugh that cut through the silence. "Oh, look what happened," she said lightly, though her tone carried no remorse. The people around her chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh with her or recoil. The sight of Marcus, standing still with wine dripping from his shirt, became a spectacle, a cruel diversion in an evening of excess. Marcus felt the warmth of the wine seeping into his skin, but it wasn't the physical discomfort that burned. It was the humiliation, the sting of being reduced to entertainment. He wanted to retreat, to find a quiet corner and breathe, but every eye at the table was on him. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Your dignity is yours. Guard it." He stood tall, tray steady in his hand, his eyes meeting Evelyn's for the first time. There was no apology in her gaze, only challenge. The guests around her murmured, some shifting uncomfortably, others smirking in complicity. Marcus sensed the unspoken question hanging in the air. How would he respond? Would he shrink? Would he apologize for something that wasn't his fault, or would he stand his ground? He forced his voice to remain calm as he excused himself to fetch a towel, his steps deliberate. Every movement felt heavy, as though the weight of centuries of injustice pressed on his shoulders. He could feel eyes following him, whispers trailing in his wake. In the quiet of the service hall, he pressed the towel against his shirt, the red stain spreading like a wound. He took a deep breath, fighting the urge to let anger consume him. But when he returned to the ballroom, tray in hand, once more Evelyn's laughter greeted him like a taunt. She had already moved on to another story, her companions hanging on her every word. To her, the incident was nothing, just a fleeting amusement in a life of power. To Marcus, it was everything. The humiliation wasn't over. Later that night, as Marcus cleared empty glasses from Evelyn's table, she leaned back again, her voice rising above the music. "Be careful this time," she said mockingly, loud enough for others to hear. Her companions chuckled. The words stung not because of their content, but because of their intent, to belittle, to remind him of his place. Marcus's hand tightened around the tray. He wanted to respond, to defend his dignity, but he knew the risk. A single word out of line could cost him his job. Jobs like his weren't easily replaced. His mother's bills depended on him. His sister's future depended on him. He swallowed the words burning at the back of his throat, lowering his gaze as he stepped away. But the night was far from finished, and Evelyn wasn't done. The music swelled, the string quartet playing louder as though to mask the tension simmering at Evelyn's table. Marcus moved away, but the echo of her words followed him like a shadow. He kept his tray balanced, his posture straight, but inside, his thoughts churned. Each step reminded him of the humiliation still wet on his shirt, the weight of laughter at his expense. In the back hall, some of his fellow servers glanced at him with quiet sympathy. They had seen it happen, how Evelyn's hand had tipped the glass, how her mockery lingered. But sympathy was silent in their world. They had all learned the same lesson. Don't get involved. To speak up meant risking your own livelihood. Marcus didn't fault them for their silence. They were survivors, just like him. He returned to the ballroom with a steadiness that belied the storm inside. Each time he approached Evelyn's table, he felt the sharpness of her gaze. She seemed amused by his composure, as if daring him to break. Power wasn't just in wealth. It was in the ability to provoke and control another person's reaction. Evelyn wielded it effortlessly, like a weapon. As the night edged toward its final hours, the gala grew rowdier. Guests loosened ties, laughter grew unrestrained, and bottles of wine emptied faster than they were uncorked. Marcus kept working, silently enduring, but Evelyn seemed determined to push boundaries further. At one point, she deliberately tapped her empty glass against the table until he came. When he reached for it, she released it too quickly, forcing him to catch it midair. The table erupted in laughter. To the wealthy, it was harmless fun. To Marcus, it was degradation, masquerading as entertainment. He reminded himself again, dignity is yours, guard it. He swallowed the bitterness rising in his throat, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing him falter. Yet with each insult, each smirk, the thread of restraint tightened, threatening to snap. The other guests noticed. Some exchanged uneasy glances, aware of the cruelty yet unwilling to intervene. Speaking against Evelyn Cross wasn't just socially dangerous, it could be financially ruinous. Her influence stretched across industries. Her name carried weight. To challenge her was to risk being cut out of her world. So they laughed, or looked away, or sipped their wine in silence. In their avoidance, Marcus saw the reflection of a greater truth. Injustice thrived not only through cruelty, but through complicity. It was in one of these moments, when Marcus bent to clear plates from her table, that Evelyn struck again. She leaned toward her companions, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard. "You'd think with all that practice carrying trays they'd be better at staying clean," she said, her words dripping with contempt. Laughter followed. Marcus froze, his hands tightening around the plates. Heat surged through him, but he forced his face to remain expressionless. He lifted the plates, turned, and walked away, each step heavier than the last. Inside, however, the storm raged louder. He thought of his mother, working double shifts with dignity despite exhaustion. He thought of his sister, hopeful about college. He thought of his father, gone too soon, who had taught him that a man's worth was measured by how he carried himself, under pressure. And yet how much could one man carry? The humiliation became unbearable when Evelyn's actions escalated further. Near the end of the gala, as dessert was being served, Marcus approached with a tray of delicate confections. The room was loud, guests distracted, and his movements careful. But as he leaned near Evelyn's table, she reached suddenly for her glass again. With a flick of her wrist, the last of the wine sloshed forward, this time directly onto the tray, splashing across the desserts and dripping onto Marcus's arm. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the nearby tables. A few people chuckled nervously, unsure if it was intentional or not. Evelyn, however, laughed openly, tossing her head back as though she had just delivered the evening's greatest punchline. Marcus stood frozen, the tray trembling slightly in his hands. His arm stung where the wine had soaked through, but it wasn't the physical sensation that shook him. It was the humiliation, the deliberate nature of it, the knowledge that she had reduced him to nothing more than a spectacle. The room's laughter blurred into a dull roar in his ears. In that moment, time seemed to stretch. Marcus saw himself reflected in the polished marble floors, stained, humiliated, yet still standing. He thought of the countless nights he had endured, in silence, of the years he had swallowed pride to survive. He thought of the promise he had made to himself that he would never allow anyone to strip him of his dignity. And as Evelyn's laughter echoed in his mind, something shifted inside him. For the first time that night, Marcus lifted his eyes fully to hers. His gaze was steady, unflinching. It wasn't defiance in the loud, reckless sense. It was something quieter, stronger, an assertion of humanity. Evelyn's laughter faltered for the briefest moment, as though she had not expected him to look back, to meet her cruelty without shrinking. But before he could act, before he could respond in a way that would define the night, the host of the gala announced the closing remarks. The crowd shifted its attention, clapping politely as speeches began once again. The moment passed, yet the tension lingered, coiled tightly around Marcus's chest. He retreated to the service hall once more, pressing his hands against the counter, his breath uneven. The stain on his shirt was deeper now, spreading like a wound that refused to close. He stared at it, the red against the white, a stark reminder of the evening's humiliation. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him, endure as he always had, or finally stand up, not just for himself, but for every silent injustice he had carried. As he stood there, the muffled sound of applause drifted from the ballroom. The night was drawing to a close. Guests would soon begin to leave, gathering their coats and bidding farewells. For most, the evening would be remembered for speeches and music, for laughter and deals made. But for Marcus, it had already become a turning point. He wiped his arm with a towel, straightened his uniform as best he could, and lifted his tray once more. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with resolve. The night wasn't finished, and neither was he. What happened next would not only shock the room, it would leave them stunned in silence, questioning not just Evelyn Cross, but themselves. The final applause faded, leaving behind the echo of clinking glasses and murmured goodbyes. Guests began to gather their coats and clutch purses, the glittering evening drawing to a close. For many, it was a night of indulgence and vanity, an event that would be remembered only as a line on their social calendars. But for Marcus, the Weight of the evening pressed harder with every passing second. The stains on his shirt had dried into deep, dark patches, their edges stiff against the white cotton. They were more than marks of spilled wine. They were emblems of humiliation, symbols of how easily his humanity had been dismissed. Each time he caught his reflection in the polished silver trays, he saw not himself, but the cruelty inflicted upon him. Marcus carried himself through the crowd one final time, his tray balanced as always, his steps silent but deliberate. Yet, this time, there was something different in the way he moved. It wasn't the rhythm of survival anymore. It was the rhythm of decision. Evelyn Cross was still at her table, surrounded by her admirers. Her laughter rang out as though nothing unusual had occurred, as though the evening had been hers to command from start to finish. She gestured dramatically, the emeralds at her neck catching the fading light. She was untouchable, her power unquestioned, her arrogance unchecked. Until Marcus stopped. He set his tray down carefully on a nearby table, the glasses clinking softly against one another. A hush began to ripple across the room, subtle at first, then growing. Guests noticed the stillness in his movements, the way he straightened his shoulders, the way his gaze fixed not on the floor, but directly ahead. It was a small act, yet, in that room of wealth and power, it carried a gravity no one expected. Marcus stepped forward, each stride measured, unhurried. The hum of conversation faltered. By the time he reached Evelyn's table, silence had spread like a tide. Her companions turned toward him, some frowning, others curious. Evelyn herself leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. She was amused. He was resolute. For a long moment, Marcus stood there, wine stains dark against his white shirt, hands steady at his sides. The silence deepened, charged with anticipation. Then, in a voice calm and unwavering, he spoke. "Tonight," he said, his tone carrying across the room without effort, something was spilled, and it wasn't just wine. A ripple passed through the guests, a shift in the air. Evelyn's smirk faltered just slightly. Marcus continued, his words deliberate, each one chosen with care. "What was spilled tonight," he said, "was dignity, respect, humanity, and not just mine. Every time someone laughs at another person's humiliation, every time cruelty is excused because of wealth or status, we all lose something far greater than we realize." The silence was absolute now. Guests who had moments ago been preparing to leave stood frozen, eyes locked on him. Some shifted uncomfortably, others leaned in, drawn by the quiet force of his words. "I have worked in this hotel for years," Marcus said, his gaze unwavering. "I've served countless glasses, cleared countless plates, and endured countless slights. But tonight reminded me of something my mother once told me. Dignity is not something you give away. It is something you guard, and no one, no matter how powerful, has the right to take it." A murmur spread through the crowd, low and unsettled. Evelyn's companions glanced at her, waiting for her reaction. She sat still, her smirk gone, her eyes sharp. But Marcus didn't look away. "You may see a waiter," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying in the silence. "But I am more than this uniform. I am a son, a brother, a man with dreams. I am not invisible, and I will not be entertainment for someone else's cruelty." His words hung in the air like a blade. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, a sound emerged from the back of the room, a single clap. It was hesitant, unsure, but it broke the silence. Another followed, then another. Within seconds, applause spread across the ballroom, building into a wave that crashed against the walls. Guests stood, some reluctantly, others with conviction, their clapping filling the air. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply stood tall, his eyes still fixed on Evelyn Cross. She remained seated, her face pale beneath the glow of the chandeliers. The applause wasn't for her. For once, the room's attention had shifted entirely away from her orbit, and in that shift, her power faltered. Marcus turned, stepping away from the table with the same deliberate calm that had brought him there. The applause followed him, echoing through the ballroom like a storm breaking. He walked toward the exit, each step steady, his head held high. Behind him, Evelyn sat frozen, her hand tightening around the stem of her glass. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, she had been silenced, not by wealth, not by influence, but by dignity too powerful to dismiss. Marcus didn't look back. As he disappeared into the service hall, the applause still ringing, one truth became undeniable. He had stunned the room. Not with anger, not with defiance, but with dignity so profound it could not be ignored. The night would be remembered, not for the speeches, not for the music, not even for Evelyn Cross's emerald necklace. It would be remembered for the moment. A man covered in wine stains stood taller than anyone else in the room. The applause that filled the ballroom lingered long after Marcus had stepped into the service hall. It was not the raucous applause given for a celebrity or the polite applause for a speech. It was something deeper, heavier. It carried with it an acknowledgement, a quiet reckoning that many in that room had not expected to confront. When the last echoes faded into silence, the guests remained unsettled. Their conversations no longer flowed with ease. Their laughter no longer rang freely. Something had shifted, and no amount of champagne could drown it out. Back at her table, Evelyn Cross sat frozen. Her glass rested untouched in her hand, her posture stiff. For the first time that evening, she was not the center of admiration but of scrutiny. Her companions, once eager to laugh at her jokes, now avoided her gaze. A few excused themselves quietly, retreating toward the exit. Her power, so effortless only moments ago, seemed fragile now, cracked by the weight of a truth she had no defense against. The stain of her actions clung heavier than the wine she had spilled. Marcus, meanwhile, retreated into the staff quarters. He leaned against the wall, his hands trembling, not from fear, but from release. His chest rose and fell with sharp breaths, his body still buzzing with adrenaline. He had not planned to speak. He had not rehearsed his words. They had come from a place deeper than thought, born of years of quiet endurance and silent humiliation. For the first time, he had let that weight rise to the surface, and he had released it into the open. In the silence of the hall, Marcus thought of his mother. He could almost hear her voice, steady and strong. "Your dignity is yours. Guard it." Tonight, he had done just that. He thought of his sister, who would one day walk into her own rooms filled with judgment, and he prayed she would carry herself with the same strength. He thought of his father, whose absence had left wounds, but whose memory had planted the seeds of resilience in him. The hotel manager eventually approached, his expression unreadable. Marcus braced himself for reprimand. After all, speaking out in front of wealthy guests was unheard of, dangerous even. But the manager surprised him. In a low voice, firm but not unkind, he said, "You represented this hotel with more dignity than anyone tonight. Go home. Rest. We'll talk tomorrow." It wasn't praise, not exactly, but it was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, Marcus realized, was a form of respect he rarely received in his line of work. He nodded, gathered his belongings, and left. The hotel threw the service exit into the cool night air. The city lights shimmered against the dark sky, and for the first time in years, Marcus felt taller than the buildings around him. The stains on his shirt were still visible, but he no longer saw them as marks of humiliation. They had become symbols of endurance, of resilience, of a night when he refused to be invisible. Word of what had happened spread quickly. Some guests recounted the moment with awe, describing the way Marcus's voice had carried through the ballroom. Others spoke of it with discomfort, unwilling to admit how complicit they had been in the laughter before the silence. A few dismissed it as drama, a fleeting outburst from a waiter who had forgotten his place. But no matter the interpretation, no one could deny the truth. The room had been shaken. For Evelyn Cross, the incident lingered like a shadow. In the days that followed, whispers circulated in her circles. Business partners who once laughed at her table now questioned her judgment. Journalists, hungry for stories of hypocrisy among the elite, caught wind of the event. What had seemed like harmless cruelty in the moment became a stain on her reputation. She had spent her life building an empire of power, yet it took only a single evening for a waiter's dignity to expose its cracks. Marcus, however, did not dwell on Evelyn. His thoughts turned inward toward the meaning of what had happened. He realized that his words had not only defended himself, they had given voice to something larger. Every waiter, every busboy, every unseen worker who had ever been humiliated in silence had, in some small way, been represented in that moment. In the quiet of his apartment, Marcus sat with his mother and sister, recounting the night. His mother listened with tears in her eyes, pride etched into every line of her face. "You didn't just guard your dignity," she told him softly. "You reminded others of their own." His sister hugged him tightly, her voice muffled against his chest. "You showed me I don't have to stay silent," she whispered. Those words struck Marcus deeply. More than applause, more than acknowledgement, it was this, the ripple effect. Of courage, that mattered most. The incident became more than a personal triumph. It became a reminder that racism and cruelty often thrived in subtle ways, in spilled wine, in mocking laughter, in the expectation of silence. Marcus's refusal to remain invisible had broken that cycle, if only for a moment. And sometimes, a moment is enough to ignite change. Weeks passed and Marcus returned to work. Some guests treated him with newfound respect, offering polite nods or kind words. Others remained indifferent, unchanged. Evelyn Cross never returned to the Ashton Grand. Perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of pride. It didn't matter. Her absence was louder than her presence had ever been. For Marcus, life moved forward. He still carried trays, still balanced glasses, still wore the uniform that made him appear invisible to so many. But something within him had shifted irrevocably. He no longer saw himself as merely enduring. He saw himself as shaping. Every step he took, every tray he carried, every quiet moment of service was now grounded in the knowledge that he had once stunned a room full of power with nothing more than truth. And that truth was this: dignity belongs to all. The story of that night echoed far beyond the walls of the Ashton. Guests who had been present shared it with friends, who shared it with others. It became a whispered parable among the city's elite, a reminder that cruelty carries consequences and that humanity cannot be dismissed. Some rolled their eyes, dismissing it as overblown. But others reflected, and in their reflection, seeds of change were planted. Marcus did not seek fame. He did not seek recognition. All he had ever wanted was to be seen, as a man, as a human, as someone with worth. On that night, under the glittering chandeliers, he had claimed that worth for himself. And though the applause had faded, the impact endured. Racism often disguises itself as indifference, as carelessness, as a joke at someone else's expense. But Marcus's story reminded everyone who heard it that silence is not neutral, it is complicity. And dignity, once asserted, can disrupt even the most powerful of rooms. Years later, when Marcus finally left the hotel to pursue his dream of studying architecture, he carried the memory of that night with him, not as a wound, but as a foundation. He designed spaces with intention, places where people, no matter their background, could feel visible, respected, and valued. His work became a testament to the lesson he had lived, that dignity, once guarded, becomes unshakable. And so, the night when a billionaire spilled wine on a black waiter became more than an incident. It became a story, one that spread, one that lingered, one that reminded all who heard it that humanity cannot be bought, silenced, or mocked into invisibility. The impact was not measured in applause, nor in whispers, nor even in the downfall of Evelyn Cross's reputation. It was measured in the countless individuals who, hearing the story, stood a little taller, spoke a little louder, and refused to surrender their own dignity. In the end, Marcus Hale did not just guard his dignity. He ignited a spark. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories and new videos.